Right, we're standing here in the German military cemetery in Glencree. Personally, I prefer to call it a war cemetery because 1/3 of the people in here are civilians, not military. And a lot of people ask the question, how did this come about in Ireland, a neutral country, that you have a German war cemetery? All during the Second World War, planes were attacking Britain and attacking British and American ships out in the Atlantic. And if they got hit, they had very limited options as to where they could go. The most preferred option was neutral Ireland, try and get the plane to neutral Ireland. And quite a lot of German military planes crashed in Ireland during the Second World War. Many of the pilots and the crew survived, but quite a number didn't. In addition, there was a big battle, naval battles going on out in the Atlantic, and bodies were being washed up regularly, many of whom could be identified from their uniforms as German. There are also 49 civilians in here. 46 of them were on a ship being transported to Canada. They were German civilians rounded up in England and sent to Canada, and most unfortunately sunk by a German submarine. There's also 6 from the First World War. During the First World War, we were under Britain and we were part of Britain. And there were 2,500 prisoners of war down in Templemore in Richmond Barracks, which is now the Garda Training College. And there was another 600 civilians in Oldcastle Workhouse in County Meath. German civilians living in Ireland, and they were rounded up, put in Oldcastle. So there's 3 of those civilians buried here, and there's 3 soldiers who were in Templemore and who died there. Now, they were buried all over the country, in graves everywhere, many of them unmarked. So you were depending on local knowledge as to where they were. And during the 1950s, the German government put pressure on the Irish government for permission to exhume all these people and put them into one place. A delegation from Germany and officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs had spent the day all over the Wicklow Mountains, fruitless. And they were coming home down the road here, and this is originally a quarry. If you look at the back there, it's a quarry. And there was a river running down the side. And they were passing by, and one of the Germans said, "Stop." Car stopped, he got out, he came in, and he said, "If we can get this place, we can fit it in here." And of course, one of the unusual features here, unlike most military cemeteries, is that there's 2 in each grave. And that's because of the space. They also have flat stones because it's such a small site that upright stones would be just too much in a place like this. So it's very well designed and very creatively designed. But it started as a quarry. And when they got it, the ground level was about 15 feet below where we are now, because if you look from the gateway in, we have come up a hill. So they started building it. This is a big retaining wall that goes down about 20 feet there. So what you had in there was a big hole. Meantime, forensic scientists and pathologists from Germany had come over and were going all over the country, getting these bodies dug up and verifying that they were German and could they be identified. Now, 58 of the bodies here are identified, the rest are not identified. Individually, there is evidence, either documentation or uniform, that they're German, but not their name. And they were exhumed, and then on a particular week, on a particular date in 1959, they were all brought up here. And they weren't buried in the sense of digging a hole, because there was no soil. The coffins were put down there, one on top of the other, and soil was poured in on top of them. Do you understand me? There weren't a whole load of individual graves. And there's some very, very unusual features about some of them, which we can go into now, and I'll show you. This grave here is absolutely unique in the world, this particular one here. And the reason it's unique, well, you start off with 2 in the one grave, which is unusual, but not unique. And it's particularly unusual here. So two into one grave. The next thing, when you look closely, one of them is a victim of the First World War, and the other is a victim of the Second World War. And when you look, do a bit of research and look further at it, the First World War person, Erwin Schatz, is a civilian. And the Second World War is a Luftwaffe officer. Then we look at it again, and when we do the research, we find that the civilian from the First World War is a Jew. And of course, the Luftwaffe officer is the German Air Force. And what an extraordinary thing to have a Jew and a German officer in the same grave. And then finally, you're looking at a Christian and a Jew in the same grave, which, leaving aside the military thing, is absolutely unique. And there's no other grave in a military cemetery with that particular combination. This is the grave of Walter Richter, and he was a submarine man in the First World War. And on the night of the 9th of August 1917, he was in a submarine off Dunmore East. And that submarine was laying mines, because we were British at that stage under Britain, and the objective was to prevent ships being able to get into the harbours on the south of Ireland. So this submarine was full of mines. And the next thing, it blew up. The whole submarine just blew up. And you can imagine what that amount of mines. There were 3 people standing on the conning tower, you know, the tower that sticks out of the top of the submarine. And they were blown out of the conning tower. One was the captain, and he was the only person to survive, and he was found by local fishermen, taken on board, and when the British discovered who he was whisked away to England to be interrogated. The captain said there were 2 others with him on the conning tower, and that as far as he knew, they were still alive. But they couldn't find the other 2. And a couple of days later, Walter Richter's body was washed up on the shore. And he was one of the 2 that the captain said had been with him. Dead, of course, now. The other man, we don't know what happened. So here you have a man set out from Germany, First World War, submarine full of mines, laying these mines off Dunmore East, and up goes the whole lot. Now that submarine was raised by the British Navy, and they decided to bury the bodies inside, which would have been horribly mutilated to this stage, to bury them at sea. So the remainder of the crew are buried at sea. And that submarine lay in the harbour of Dunmore East for years and years and years, and the kids could go down and climb over and in and out of it and so on. And then in the 1970s, it was decided to extend the pier at Dunmore East. So they needed something to kind of, bit of a foundation. So they got the submarine, and they pulled it in and laid it out. And when you walk along the extended pier in Dunmore East, you're walking on top of a German U-boat that's now buried in the pier. And probably in 1,000 years, somebody will dig that up and say, what have we got here? And that's Walter Richter. And wherever he thought he was going to end up, it wasn't here. And he's in the same grave as Lieutenant Karl Hermann, a Luftwaffe officer. One from the First World War, one from the Second World War. Right, this is the grave of Lieutenant Kurt Tigerman, and he is the youngest person buried in this cemetery. He was 19 years of age. And what I find extraordinary about him, he was the pilot commander of a Heinkel 111, which is a huge plane. Now nowadays you'd hardly let your 19-year-old son out the door, you know? And here he was, the commander of this huge plane, and there were 4 of them on board. Now the job of these planes was to fly from France, because Germany had taken over France at this stage, way out into the Atlantic. And they had two functions: to look for convoys and to check the weather. And on the 11th of October 1941, Kurt Tigerman's plane, huge plane, shot in off the south coast in over Wexford. And locals who saw it at the time say it didn't seem to be an engine trouble or anything. So the feeling would be that he was being pursued. Because while those planes could get out into the Atlantic, the weakness now was that the RAF now knew that they were there. They didn't know when they were going out, but they knew when they were coming back, and they would be waiting for them. And you can imagine the four crew, Tigerman flying, probably was co-pilot, the other two trying to see where this other plane that was attacking them. And when you think that at 19 years of age, at the outbreak of the Second World War, Winston Churchill issued instructions that every male German citizen between the age of 17 and 45 living in Britain was to be rounded up and interned. And they commandeered a whole load of holiday camps, Butlins, Walkers and so on, and they rounded up all these people, a few thousand people, and they put them in these holiday camps. One of them was a chap called Hans Müller. Hans Müller, he was 26 in 1938 when he fled Germany, and he got across Holland, Belgium and into England. And he got to London, and he got a job in a clothing shop in London. He met a girl, Dora Lucas, and they got engaged. And then with the outbreak of the war, this instruction goes out: round up all male Jews, and Hans is rounded up and he's put in a holiday camp in Devon. Now his fiancée at that stage, she did make appeal, look, this man is Jewish, like, you got to understand the situation they were in, of course. Churchill said, we haven't the time for all that, just round up the lot. So here's poor Hans Müller. Now after a while, somebody in the civil service in England got the bright idea, we could send a load of these guys to Canada. And they commandeered this cruise ship to send them to Canada. And Müller was one of them. I think he might have welcomed that, because if he got to Canada, it was a totally different environment. You wouldn't be in Canada, and maybe Dora could come over. Now, I've no evidence, but my feeling is he might have said, yeah, I'll go for that. Anyway, hundreds of them were put on this ship, German and Italians, some Italians, to go from Liverpool to Canada. The captain was alarmed. He was a cruise ship captain, and he went to the Admiralty and said, look, this is madness. To send a ship like this out into the North Atlantic with no escort, nothing. Now at that stage it would have been painted grey, you know, they painted them all grey. And he was told to, you see, he wasn't the Navy man, told to stop whinging and just go. So off they set. Now, to add to the tragedy, they had very few soldiers to guard them. So the upper deck, all around the edge, had coiled barbed wire to stop them trying. But of course, when the trouble came, they couldn't get to the lifeboats through this barbed wire. And then the second thing, to keep them under control, they were locked down below deck at night, locked, the doors locked. So off they set, and the next morning, off the coast of Donegal, a submarine, German submarine on the way home with one torpedo, a faulty torpedo, spotted the ship. It would have been flying the British flag, of course. The captain interviewed afterwards said he thought it was a troop carrier, carrying troops, and let fly with the one torpedo and sank the ship. For weeks and weeks afterwards, bodies were being washed up, many of whom, of course, weren't identified and will never be identified. But 46 of them were identified as German civilians. And Hans Müller was identified that in his pocket he had a songbook from Walker's holiday camp in Devon. and he had a note for Dora in the pocket. And afterwards, the Irish Guard sent over his papers to London, and they called to the shop, and she confirmed, yes, it's him. I don't know if she ever visited here or ever saw the grave, but there's a little story that came to him. Now, he was buried in Donegal for years and years and years, and then in the 50s, late 50s, when they were creating this place, they started to look for bodies from the Arandora Star. There was discussion as to whether they should be put in here, and the conclusion by the German government was A, they were German citizens, B, they were not military, but they were victims of war, and therefore should be in this. Hans Müller carries the other distinction in that he's Jewish. So now we have two Jewish people. So Hans Müller and Erwin Schatz, two Jewish civilians, never fired a gun in anger, never attacked anybody, just wanted to live their lives in peace, and they never in their wildest dreams thought they would be here, sharing graves with Luftwaffe. During the Second World War, quite a number of German spies landed in Ireland. All of them were caught, but the most successful of them, who managed to evade capture for over 18 months, was Major Hermann Goertz. Now Goertz, we know from the records in Germany now, looking back, Goertz was sent on a specific mission, and his rank major, he was the most senior of the spies who were sent to Ireland, and his mission was called Operation Kathleen. Germany had been getting communications from the IRA here in Southern Ireland, to the effect that if Germany gave them guns and munitions, they would cause havoc in Northern Ireland, and so on. Now, you got to remember, there was an underlying sympathy with Germany in Southern Ireland, because the guns for the 1916 Rising came from Germany and were brought in. So there was an underlying thing there. Hertz set out in 1940 in a plane to parachute into Ireland. He was to parachute into Wicklow, and his instructions were to try and get in touch with the IRA. Now in those days the technology was limited. It was a bad night, cloud, so on. Eventually the pilot said to him, look, all we can tell you is that we're over Ireland. We don't know where, but fuel-wise, you either jump now or you're going home. So he decided to jump. And he landed in Bellivre, in County Meath. Okay? Now, when a spy jumps, a second parachute comes, which is a big container with all his stuff, you know, the radio and bits and stuff. People say the second container was never found. I maintain it was found, but we don't know by who, and it's probably in some farmer's barn in County Meath. So here he is now, just in what he's standing in. And amazingly, having never been in Ireland before, he walked from Bellivre to Lara in County Wicklow. Imagine that. And the more extraordinary thing, along the way, he called into a Garda station for directions and was given directions. And on he went. Anyway, he got in touch with the IRA, and they moved him from safe houses here and there. Now, fairly quickly, and we know this from the records in Germany, whatever you do, don't send them arms. But now he's stuck in Ireland. And there was a raid on a house 18 months later, and there was an extra person in the house. Who are you? So, and that was it, he's caught. Now, you couldn't be caught in a better country, because we were neutral, and you were free to move around. So where would you go, like, you know? And he spent the remainder of the war in Athlone military barracks. And then after the war, he got a job here. He became the administrator of Operation Shamrock, and he was the perfect man for it. All these German children coming in, he spoke German. He was a military officer, so he knew about order and discipline, and by all accounts he was very good at it. And he made an application to be naturalised here in Ireland, that he could live here, and also for his family to come, and he was succeeding in that. When in 1947 word came up here that he was wanted, and the special branch came up and took him away, and it transpired that a request had come from the Allies in Germany for him to be returned. So he was brought into Dublin Castle, and through listening and hearing, he deduced that he was being sent not only to Germany, but to the eastern sector, the Russian sector. And imagine all those years. He'd been here from 1940, and this was 1947. From somewhere inside, he pulled out a pill, and he was gone. Cyanide. Gone. Now, he was initially buried, this place didn't exist. He was buried in Glencree Cemetery. When this place was built, the German government resisted his reinterment here. But his family appealed and appealed and appealed, and eventually in the 1970s, in the dark of the night, his body was taken from Glencree and put here. Now, do you see that headstone over there? See that headstone over there? That's the headstone that was on Hermann Goertz's grave in Dean's Grange. The sword with the barbed wire is the symbol of prisoner of war. And it sits on a kind of a stone like that. And if you dig down there where that little cross is, you'll see his name. This is Oscar Metz. And his story is absolutely extraordinary. He is in his early 30s. And on the 17th of December 1942, he appeared in Castletown Roach in County Cork. How he got there, whether he fell out of the sky, whether he came in on a rubber boat, we don't know. But here's what we know about him. He called in to the local parish priest, and of course he would have had an accent, you see. So he explained that by saying he was Czechoslovakian, and that he had been here at the outbreak of war and was now trapped here. And he was living hand-to-mouth, job here, job there, and you wouldn't have a few bob, father. And the priest gave him a shilling. Now, a shilling in 1947 was a fair bit. He walked down to the only shop in Castletown Roach, and he bought milk, cheese, and bread. He turned around, and as he was going out, bumped into the local Garda. And he quizzed them a bit, you know, who are you so? Anyway, some little light went off in the guard's head, and he said, would you mind emptying your pockets? And out came a Luger, a compass, and a silk scarf which was a map of Ireland. And the guard said, oh, you'll have to come with me, you know. So he brings him back up to his house, which doubled as the kind of Garda station. And he said, I'll have to ring Cork, see what to do with you. Now, in those days, of course, the phone was a wind-up, you know. So Oscar Metz said to him, I'm a bit hungry, is it all right if I eat? Oh, yeah. Now, on the broader picture, if you're going to be caught, you couldn't find a better place than Ireland, because happy days, your troubles were over. So the guard is trying to ring Cork. Oscar has permission to eat the bread and the milk, and the next thing is the bump. And the guard turned around, and he's dead on the floor. He's taken a cyanide tablet. His troubles were over.